Hi everyone, and welcome to the next session at the Museums Association's virtual conference. This one's called 5 Mindsets for Museums of the Future. I'm Simon Stevens and from the Museums Association, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Before I hand over to our chair, Alexis Mannion, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. I'm sure a few of you have heard these already, but this will be the first session for some people, so do bear with me. Firstly, as attendees, your cameras and microphones should be automatically disabled, but you can use the chat function on the menu bar to talk and introduce yourselves, talk to others, share links and experiences. You can also tweet using our hashtag for the conference, which is #museums2020. There will be some time for questions today, so if there is something you'd like to address the speakers, please can you share it by the Q&A function. The Q&A function is at the bottom of the menu bar. The chair will put selected questions to today's speakers, so please keep them short and to the point. You can leave and rejoin the session at any time. We are recording today's session and it will be available on the MA website in due course. We have both audio description and live closed captioning working today. Audio description uses the language interpretation feature on Zoom, which allows you to select a language to listen alongside the main session. If you require audio description, please press interpretation on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen and select French. Please leave the original audio on or you'll not be able to hear the conference speaker. There's also live closed captioning available. If you require live captioning, please press closed captioning and select show subtitles. So hopefully there won't be any technical problems. If you do have anything you need to contact me about, just contact me in the chat privately. But now that's all out of the way, I'll hand over to Alexis Mannion to get the session started. Over to you, Alexis.
Thank you very much, Simon. And good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to be here and thank you so much for joining us over lunch. Simon, thank you for all the housekeeping. I shouldn't have to do anything there, but just to be crystal clear, it'd be really helpful for us if you could say hello in the chat and then save any questions for the Q&A section, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can towards the end. So just to sort of say a little bit about who I am, who UKRI is, and a little bit about the liminal space before we hand over to them. We've been really lucky to listen into a few of these sessions from the conference so far, and I really hope that today's session is going to provide lots of synergy and some tangible outputs to take some of these discussions forward. So bear with me, I'll just share my screen and hope that that works with you all, and I'll run through a few slides by way of introduction. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. I shall just start. Here we go. Okay, so our session today is called Mindsets for Museums of the Future. I'm Alexis Mannion, I'm the Public Engagement Lead at UKRI, and I'm joined by Sarah Douglas, Director at the Liminal Space, and also Liv Taylor, who's carried out, I think it's fair to say, a huge amount of research into this really exciting and challenging area. So I'll shortly be handing over to them and they can introduce themselves. Before I go too much further, I'm aware that I've said UKRI lots of times. UKRI stands for UK Research and Innovation. It was launched in 2018 from what was the Research Council's UK, and we're a non-departmental public body. So we're arm's length from government, but we are sponsored by BEIS. So that's the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department. UKRI brings together the 7 research councils, of which you probably know lots of them, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, for example, as well as Research England, who have responsibility for some of the university museums. But we also bring together the UK's new innovation agency, Innovate UK, and you might know some of their work that they've done with museums and galleries around audiences of the future. A little bit about me before I talk specifically about public engagement at UKRI. I've been in the relatively new team at UKRI for about a year now. My background is in museums and public engagement. So I spent 7 years at the Science Museum in the learning, education, outreach and public programs teams before I moved to the Francis Crick Institute to set up the learning, exhibitions and public engagement departments. I went to Wellcome from there, where I worked in funding within public engagement, and I'm now leading the cultural programme development at UKRI. So public engagement at UKRI really exists to support world-leading researchers and innovators to create a more healthy, prosperous and sustainable society. And we do that because we think that by creating these opportunities for people to participate and discuss and help to create research, that it makes the research and innovation more relevant, impactful and trusted. And we do this across our portfolio with a range of programs, which I'll just touch on. We have 4 goals across our team, the first of which very much speaks to this new cultural program that we're launching today, and is very much about engaging underrepresented communities and places with research and innovation. And I'll talk about that one in a little bit more detail in a moment. The second goal is that we actively involve a wide range of people in our work, and we do that through programs like our citizen science and our place grants to ensure that researchers know how and why and when to involve more people in their research and that they're supported to do so. Through funding organisations like STEM Learning and the British Science Association, we are hoping to nurture a future generation that's passionate about research, not just in STEM and science subjects, but also across the arts, the humanities and social sciences. And then lastly, we're really hoping to try to do more now to listen to public concerns and aspirations about research. So through dialogues and through commissioning research like this, and particularly through programs like ScienceWise, we're ensuring that more diverse people have a say in the creation, the design and the deployment of new research and innovation. But to come back to that first goal, which really is where our cultural programmes lie, and forgive me because I'm aware that I'm talking to museum practitioners, and this is a slide that I've used internally at UKRI to really kind of outline, I think, the synergies between our team and what museums and galleries are doing and some of the challenges they face. But our goal here is to really ensure that everyone in the UK has the opportunity to participate in research and innovation as either audiences or collaborators, no matter where they live or what their background. And I've been involved for the last year in scoping how we can work with museums, galleries and the broader cultural sector to kind of champion this, this portfolio internally. So for us, I think we've really spent the last year understanding the very unique role that cultural venues have in society. We've heard so much this morning about collections and content that can be told and reimagined and celebrated. And I think particularly with research, helping local communities to understand the role of research in society is an area that we could really focus. We know that museums and galleries are trusted and safe spaces for some people, but not for everybody. That's an area that we're really keen to probe further. And having talked about local and hyperlocal contexts a lot, we're keen to not ignore the fact that many institutions have really large audiences and that shouldn't be overlooked. The ability of museums and galleries to reach global audiences, particularly through the COVID pandemic, has been amazing. But essentially, and probably most importantly, we have this shared goal, I believe, around understanding and reaching audiences that don't participate, that don't collaborate or perceive engagement opportunities as being for them. And that's something that UKRI is really keen to see a change in. So in terms of where we're up to and what we're launching and announcing today, we did have a museums and galleries cultural programme that was ready to roll pre-pandemic, but as with most things museum related, it became pretty unviable after March. And so we spent the last 6 months kind of really listening and trying to understand where best we could place our support. And to that end, we are launching a new 2-strand programme today. This will be delivered through autumn and winter and beyond. And the first strand is a new devolved fund to the Museums Association, which we're really excited about. We're going to be supporting digital innovation and engagement grants across the sector. So the grants will be available for up to £50,000, and we'll be saying a lot more about this in the coming week. I know that the Museums Association team are going to be online shortly to discuss this in more detail as well. But you can keep an eye on all of our websites for more information from November the 11th. And then that brings us to where we are with today's session, which is the launch of Mindsets for Museums of the Future research, which UKRI commissioned to the Liminal Space pre-pandemic and pre-lockdown. We'd started talking to Sarah at the Liminal Space about the notion of museum futures. And we were doing that alongside our scoping work because futures is a really exciting area in which to think about research and innovation. But that obviously took on a whole new meaning and a whole new importance when lockdown came and when museums and galleries had to close in March. So we very quickly then asked Sarah and her team at the Liminal Space to do some rapid research for us into a sort of a horizon scan across global best practice to see what was really working and how museums were managing to stay innovative and to stay relevant. Sarah and then Liv have spoken to about 20 practitioners and academics from across the sector to really understand the notion of museums of the future, as well as hosting a public survey. And Liv, you might have to remind me how many participants you got, but I believe it was in the hundreds. So they've created a fantastic piece of research, which they're going to share with you now. So I will stop waffling, but just to say that we're really delighted to be working with the Museums Association. We're really thrilled to be here at your conference, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Lex, and great to meet everybody. I'm Sarah Douglas, Director of the Liminal Space, and I'm just going to give you a short intro before handing over to my colleague Liv, who's going to take you through the majority of the report. So full disclosure, it wouldn't be an online session without a bit of dodgy technology. So today, Liv and I were confronted by not working Wi-Fi. So we're joining you from two of our favourite museums featured in the research, which we would love to visit. One is the new museum in Mumbai Airport, which is where Liv is at the moment. And I'm in the Scottish Crannog Museum. And at some point we will be swatching places in a completely COVID secure way, because we are actually in the same physical space, but at a 2-meter distance, of course. So forgive our slight tech issues there. So a little bit more about the Liminal Space and how we came to be involved in this project. We are a purpose-led studio that use art and design to create groundbreaking experiences that transform what people think, feel, and do. We're specialists in public engagement and part think tank, part cross-disciplinary design studio. I'm going to start by giving you a bit of context around the work that we do. Fundamentally at Liminal Space, our work communicates different voices and narratives, whether that means framing complex research in ways the public can relate to, or empowering underserved communities and groups to share their insight with the wider world. Our approach uses a range of creative practices to bring to life these varied perspectives. We draw from the macro of individual experiences and connect that to wider social themes, trends, and issues. Here are some examples of the kind of work that we do. This project, Nightclub, is a partnership with Co-op and the Wellcome Trust, and it's a mobile installation that brings expert help directly to sleep-deprived, low-income night shift workers at retail warehouses across the country, in situ and at night. So this was a project that we started pre-COVID, but of course has become even more relevant given the kind of key workers that are keeping us all going at the moment. Timeless is another of our projects. This was a pop-up shop and fictional beauty range designed to engage young women on their choices relating to fertility and social egg freezing. In partnership with the Barbican and UCL, we created Unclaimed, a fictional lost property office with talking objects that brought the subject of ageing today to a general public audience in the Barbican's foyer spaces. And finally, Living Landscapes for the Royal Society in Ipsos Mori is an example of how we've had to, like a lot of organisations, change our practice. And this is our sort of in-the-box futures that takes debates about different topics directly to public audiences in order to inform policymaking. We frequently work with cultural institutions to deliver public-facing projects and to help them learn more about themselves and their audiences. From health and science to brands and industry, our work across different sectors means we bring cultural insights from different sectors, retail, lifestyle trends, media and entertainment, and policy into the work that we do. And it's this varied perspective that has very much informed the Museum of the Future's work today, where we've drawn on insights across all of these disciplines, alongside academic research, over 20 interviews with those in the museum's ecosystem, and a large public survey, to distill what we saw and heard into a vision for museums of the future. So on your screen now, you'll see this is just a GIF of the report itself, and we'll share a link to that in the chat at some point, and it's also on our website and shared through UKRI. What we're going to do today is present you with that vision, and we welcome your responses on how you'd like to see this thinking taking forward, which is work that we're going to be developing with UKRI over the next few months. We'll also have some time for questions at the end. We're going to present you very much our key ideas, but as you can see, the report itself is designed to be very interactive and is full of imagery and film. So I do urge you to look at it in your own time and interact with some of the interactive features on there. So this work was conducted when museums were closed. Now museums will soon be closing their doors again. What started as an opportunity to highlight trailblazing examples of emerging practice from around the world, as Alexis has mentioned, quickly evolved into a mission to explore and capture insights from this unique moment that point to how museums of the future might be. How does the Museum of the Future behave, and what are its principles? We took these questions to museum directors, cultural producers, and independent practitioners during lockdown 1, before museums reopened. This was and still is a very difficult time to be having these conversations, which is not something in any way we diminish, with the sector in peril and facing such uncertainty. But in addition to the COVID context, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there were other huge forces at play too when we were having these conversations. Our interviews took place in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests and against a backdrop of our ongoing climate crisis. All topics that came up in every interview that we did. So as we reckon with the long-term effects of these extraordinary times for people and culture, there are many practical challenges ahead, of course, but there are also huge philosophical ones. Who are museums for? How do they stay relevant? What is their role within their community? What needs to change? And crucially, how? As we heard from our interviewees, these questions have been explored, discussed, and interrogated in many different ways over the years. They are not new, but the need for accelerated action and change is. Everyone we spoke to echoed the feeling that despite the practical challenges, now is a moment to seize the opportunity to create some changes, and that things should not go back in many ways to how they were. So how do we grasp this unique moment as an opportunity to create change? Like many domains in our lives, the present moment is a catalyst to reflect and rethink. In this case, on the transformative role of culture in the museum in public and civic life. It asks us to listen to the diversity of voices and talents, both inside and outside, home in on areas that require urgent change, and to quote Esme Ward, Director of Manchester Museum, to embrace more experimental ways of working and to do more of our thinking in public. At a time when we need to learn, connect, and grow more than ever, we know museums themselves have a key role to play in facilitating transformation. in helping us to fully examine the challenges and possibilities and be bold and imaginative in how we create new shared futures. We think a lot about the future at the Liminal Space, from the future of work to the future of AI and healthcare. And one of the things that's required when thinking about the future is you have to step beyond the here and now. You have to step out of your current space. The great thing about the future is that there are no rules and nobody owns it yet. We asked our interviewees to step into that speculative futures space, to try and leave their daily realities, which often included dealing with a leaky roof or how to manage the next couple of weeks, behind, and to explore the imaginary playground where anything is possible. We're going to ask you to enter that space today. One of the questions that we asked our interviewees was, what is the most radical change the museum of today could make to become the museum of tomorrow? I invite you to think about that for a few seconds. So what did we hear? We heard the Museum of the Future described as a fluid network, something that travels to places in need, a space for advocacy and activism, spaces of community ownership and global connectivity where innovation can flourish. Still at the core, curiosity, inquiry, wonder, and debate, but a desire for change in how this is cultivated and deployed. Overwhelmingly, our research has revealed a fundamental shift away from thinking of museum practice as strictly linked to place, space, and assets, towards an emphasis on how these elements create meaningful and sustained interactions with people and communities. The word cloud that you can see at the moment comes from the public survey that we did. And we thought it was really interesting that people, community, communal, and experience were the things that really were at the heart of it. Many people we spoke to expressed their understanding of museums in terms of human qualities and approaches, as ways of thinking and ways of being. This thinking has very much informed the creation of the 5 mindsets, through which we propose the principles and dynamics of the museums of the future will play out, in order to stay relevant, innovative, and meaningful for future audiences and generations. Liv will take you through the specific mindsets in a moment, and you can read about them in more detail in the report. Mindsets does feel fitting to us for an inquiry that was conducted when the physical spaces were closed, when the museum existed for all of us in a kind of imagined space, bringing us up close to how we inhabit and relate to the museum as a psychological space and construct. And stepping into a future space where we can identify learnings and detect ways of working that can be applied in the present. We know that from monumental shifts to tiny interventions, creating practical change starts with the mindset and some funding. Thank you, UKRI. And in our research, we show how the 5 mindsets can be applied at all levels and all scales, from potted interactions and further existing current innovations to radical departures and totally new ways of operating. I'm going to pass over to Liv now. But to let you know that we're currently working on some specific projects that bring the mindsets to life and will be revealed next year, and we'd welcome your thoughts on this work, either by adding to the survey at the end of the report or by getting in touch with us directly at the Liminal Space. Thank you.
Hi there, I've just come into Scotland to present and share with you. I'm just finding my slides. So yes, there was lots of big thinking happening in our research, and I really do invite you to dive into some of the research more specifically. My aim this afternoon is to just give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the top-line thinking that kind of emerged through the research. And definitely the first place that was really important for us to start overall was not only looking at the context that was happening in 2020, but to think about the wider global kind of shifts in the way that people behave relating to their identity, how they're spending their time, how people are interacting in groups and families, and what their relationship to information and news is. So we definitely picked up on that idea of connecting to the global and the local. People are seeking that community connection, but also want to relate to the wider issues and information happening across the globe. And this particularly came up when people were talking about climate crisis and the impact that they want to create there. We thought about plurality and intersectionality and the impact of an ageing population when considering who is going to be coming into museums of the future, how they might identify themselves, and what impact that will have on how we speak to them, what we show and what we value. We recognise there's been a shift perhaps to decentralisation within, away from urban centres, and a shift in the way that we carry out our daily lives. We thought about how people are spending their time with things like on-demand food, on-demand entertainment, and shifting to this time and space, particularly at the moment, where people are working more from home and perhaps away from those major cultural centres. Obviously that's increased during the pandemic, but it was definitely a trend that was kind of emerging before then. So it's really interesting to think about how people will access their museums with that in mind. And finally, we thought about media and organisations and the overarching, perhaps, fear mentality in relation to how our interaction with information has changed over recent years. For many, there is an information overwhelm and trust in media and government has started to break down. Particularly for young people, this has caused increased anxiety over their futures. So a big question for us throughout this has been, what roles do museums have to play here? How can we mitigate or change how people feel in relation to the information they experience in the world? So to bear some of these mindsets, to the kind of coming together of all of these mindsets brought into that thinking, and also considered the domains of people and partners, place, space and object, research and innovation, and digital and data when thinking about the museum of the future as a whole. Our first mindset is called plural perspectives. And this considers the role of the museum in generating and conserving knowledge. It's the big one. Future museums, we propose, will acknowledge different types of knowing and value multiple perspectives, skills, objects, and stories. They will embody this approach through people, partners, and place, readily interrogating their existing structures and narratives and seeing the value in a diverse range of voices. When we spoke to Razia Jordan, who's an associate producer at The Bargain, she asked us, how can we define culture more broadly in the future? Many of us feel that museums are not being reactive to changing attitudes to collecting and storytelling. I hope that museums invite more tastes, experiences and values than they have historically and question how and why they classify something of quality. And I know that this theme as a top line has been really interrogated very much through this Museums Association conference. It was something that was brought up across the board with everyone that we spoke to and the public as well. It was particularly great to see Errol Carter from Culture and speaking yesterday about anti-racist museums. And we're really pleased to have included Culture and's new museum school project as part of an example of this mindset. We also spoke to Ken Arnold, who's Head of Public Engagement at Wellcome Collection and Creative Director at the Medical Museum, and he shared some really interesting insight. He said that providing real value means that everyone should be learning something in museums. This should be true for all aspects of the museum, from co-producing research to how collections are experienced. I love this. He says, a museum's alchemy lies in combining real knowledge, real experience, and real exchange to bring about deep learning. So within this mindset, and all the mindsets have kind of got their top line thinking and then are broken down into different facets. And some of the facets in plural perspectives are kind of outlined here. I won't go into them all, but of course, the kind of beginning of this mindset really relates to decolonisation. That felt like the most urgent and pressing theme for many of the people we spoke to. Since we've written the report, we have actually seen a lot more work emerging in this area, and definitely some of this has been covered at the conference so far. But some of the things we covered in the report perhaps speak to the future of what this decolonisation work might look like. More broadly than this, we propose valuing nuanced knowledge. The Museum of the Future will look at widening their understanding of culture and what is on display, finding new methods for sharing that intangible cultural heritage. The Museum of the Future will listen and respond to multiple voices, whether amateur, outsider, those from different generations, alongside the canon of the professional and the academic. And fundamentally, museums of the future will understand the power of representation, knowing that what they display will have huge impact on the people that come to see it. Pictured here on the slide is one of our amazing case studies. It's by an Architectural Association graduate called Russell Royer, and he proposed an alternative to repatriation in museums that combines architecture with choreography to respectfully and authentically bring Indigenous voices into the recontextualization of objects. Now, the report is very interactive, so you can link through and watch a video and learn more about Russell's project, and click through and see his project in full. Plural knowledge for us is really about looking at these ways of knowledge production and preservation and how it happens in museums. And of course, that really begins with having a multidisciplinary mindset. So we believe future museums will have new systems and procedures that inherently include and hire plural voices, skills and partners. Alongside that, increasingly, projects will be run in collaboration with external partners who can bring that through too, bringing new perspectives and more experimental approaches into the museum. This might, of course, include disruptive or dissenting or contrasting voices in order to give a much more broadened perspective of what happens in museums. Thinking about plural perspectives, we also thought about specifically around education, looking at the inclusive future skills that have been proposed by the World Economic Forum to create kind of engaged future citizens, whether children or adults. And we also thought about collective questioning, suggesting that the Museum of the Future will adjust their methods of display and exhibition to shift away from that more didactic, object-oriented display to much more discursive methods. When we spoke to Dr. Alex Birch, who's the head of public programs at the Natural History Museum, she said that museums need to move away from being passive to creating interaction and empowering people to take action, particularly in relation to climate change. We need to shift people's focus from the what to the why. And I think that really sums up our plural perspectives mindset. Our next mindset is called nomadic and accessible, and it really looks at where the museum takes place. It proposes that the Museum of the Future will be on the move, travelling directly to people and communities. As the decline in retail continues on the high street, museums will perhaps insert themselves into these leftover spaces to connect to communities. Artifacts and collections will travel to places near and far, and at the same time, people will visit museums' digital spaces from around the globe. A senior museum professional said to us, "We should see the museum as a service provider, bringing collections to people's daily lives and responding to places in need." This is a way about thinking about how we can create greater access to the objects, but also finding new ways to invite people into the museum. This is particularly interesting, of course, in this COVID context, where we've been restricted by the physicality of many of our museum spaces, and people haven't been able to visit museums perhaps in the traditional sense. So thinking about this, some of the facets of this mindset, nomadic and accessible, one of which is objects on the move. So we're really expressing the idea that museums of the future will find ways to facilitate the touring, sharing, and movement of objects around the country or indeed the world to create a dynamic network of exchange. By creating this greater access and visibility of objects, we have an opportunity to recontextualize and engage with these artifacts in new ways with new audiences. Our theme, thinking about museum as the shared endeavor, considers how museums can exist perhaps without a physical space, but instead through a coalescence of ideas and a communal passion. Some of the examples in the report show temporary museums, and many of these museums address audiences who perhaps feel that the traditional museum space hasn't been for them. So central to this idea is the idea of mutual exchange, collaboration, and inclusivity. When we thought about the pop-up museum, we looked at how they could perhaps borrow from the best of retail to surprise and delight. A pop-up museum is a transient, perhaps unusual space that reimagines what museum spaces look and feel like and where we might encounter one. They're ultimately agile, contemporary, and relevant. The example we've shown here is from the Empathy Museum's Mile in My Shoes, which was housed in a giant shoe box on various different high streets and spaces in towns where people could go and experience different stories, but the look and feel of it was not what you would expect from a traditional museum. Fundamentally, nomadic access reimagines where museums are It might allow larger institutions to have a presence in communities that are hard to reach, and new and smaller museums might emerge that are more agile and embedded in unusual places, creating that connection perhaps where it might not have been before. Which leads me on to our third mindset, which is community connectedness. And this centres on the active role that museums can take within their communities. We believe that the Museum of the Future will see a shift in emphasis and power from being for the people to being of the people. As one of our public museum survey respondents said, museums of the future are not there, but they're here with us. I love that. So ways in which we think this can specifically happen is firstly through perhaps civic placemaking, particularly in the context of active protesting, the climate change and thinking around Black Lives Matter. We propose that the museum will continue to be a place to come together and increasingly will be confident to be a space for activism, public debate and local expression. This might include museums opening their doors and giving room to groups that need space for dialogue, connection and reflection. Or practically, museums might learn from places like libraries, thinking about what they can lend and give access to, whether it's digital hardware or information and knowledge about gardening or sheltered accommodation, but very much creating a place for all people to come together and to create dialogue and exchange. Another way that museums might work for their community is through entrepreneurial impact, not only creating jobs for people in the local area, but perhaps taking an active role in the economy, stimulating business through offering co-working spaces, perhaps apprenticeship and vocation-based programmes. Even in some of the smallest museums, such as the Scottish Crannog Centre behind me. And we saw some really amazing examples of programming and apprenticeships that really help local young people build their own businesses and understand the future of work for themselves. Perhaps a more radical mode of this entrepreneurship might see museums take on the role of social enterprise. One of the examples that we've got in the report, and there's a picture of here, is of an East London company called Company Drinks. And they connect people through to their local history by combining the heritage and craft skills of hop and fruit picking with the enterprise skills of designing and creating a manufacturing drink from these products. So the people taking part not only learn the history of their past, but also create an impact for the future of their community. This example was actually featured in the Future of Food at the V&A, the exhibition, but I think it could be a great example for the future model of an actual museum. Lockdown, of course, has encouraged us to rethink about our global audiences that our museums reach. Many museums have actually been surprised to learn the global reach of their work during lockdown. And we believe that future museums will build upon this, having in many cases been liberated by a playful new tone of voice and more agile content creation over social media and learning from that kind of new way of engaging with people. Rethinking about our communities on a global scale also allows us to connect expertise and shared passions on a much bigger scale. And we feel that offers lots of potential for new research and projects, in fact. So fundamentally, our theme, community connectedness, really centres on the idea of what museums can do for their people, both outside and during their visit. Our fourth mindset is called meaningful experience. Now, I know experience and thinking about immersion is a bit of a buzzword, so we really wanted to interrogate what we meant by meaningful experiences in museums. We believe the Museum of the Future will continue to be a space of wonder, escape and connection. The Museum of the Future will further its role in public well-being and become more integrated in entertainment fixtures for more people. It will reimagine interactions with the public through digital and real-life experiences, fostering learning, reflection and awe. The meaningful element of this was really brought out when we spoke to Aaron Ward, who's head of audience development at the National Museums of Northern Ireland. He said, loneliness and isolation are increasing. The museum can actually act as a third space, just to hang out and allow you just to be, much in the same way you can just be in nature. Future museums can offer community spaces where people connect with the collections, but also, importantly, connect with each other. In the future, we think museums need to be able to broaden and deepen their understanding of people's reasons for visiting. Outside of learning, there are many other reasons why people come to these spaces, whether it's because it feels safe and protected, or quiet, or social. And we think museums of the future will really interrogate that to consider their ways in which they shape these experiences. Of course, it really still centers around objects. So one of our themes really looks at making memories through objects, and still centers, hopefully, the physical experience of a museum. Deep meaning will continue to be found by simply just being around these objects and artifacts. And moments of surprise and delight will be guided through innovative curation and new methods of display and replica making. This might be for an everyday normal museum encounter, or perhaps we might be considering giving special access to communities, for example, or religious groups, to have an opportunity to engage more deeply with objects of particular importance for them. So this connection to the physical is still really important. An example we shared in the report was Resurrecting the Sublime, which is an exhibition that has appeared in many different institutions by UK-based artist and designer and writer, Dr. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, that allowed visitors to smell extinct flowers that were lost due to colonial cattle ranching, river damming, and farming. Using tiny amounts of DNA extracted from the specimens of 3 flowers stored at the Harvard University Herbaria, and working with the Ginkgo Bioworks team and a smell researcher, the project used synthetic biology to predict and reconstruct the flowers' fragrances. Absolutely amazing. And this was brought to life within an exhibition space. So there was a sense of smell, there was this interesting physical space, some informational video work, and this really immersive space that people entered and almost took them back into the past, but also allowed them to deeply consider the future of technology, the future of the environment, and their relationship to it. And we think this is a really exciting example. As well as creating these wow spectacle moments, the museum will create meaningful experiences by being caring. This has, of course, again, been thrown massively into light during lockdown, not only for visitors, but many people we spoke to highlighted that museum spaces provide structure for many of their volunteers, perhaps who are isolated or from vulnerable backgrounds. So their sense of caring is very encapsulated in everyone who takes part in museums. The Museum of the Future, therefore, will exemplify principles of empathy, care, and positivity. Every museum will champion human rights and encourage local and global citizenship. They will become much more reactive in times of need and consider how their specialism might be relevant to care for and inspire particularly vulnerable groups. We do believe that digital also has a role to play in the Museum of the Future, and our theme, Deep Digital Discovery, specifically thinks about how it can be used to extend people's learning opportunities and connect with collections in different ways. Olga Kravchenko of Museumio, which is an app that won UCL's Most Promising Startup, said this amazing thing. With VR, virtual reality, they say it's not the child looking at the dinosaur, but the dinosaur looking at the child. And this is a really profound shift that can be facilitated by these digital tools. They're not there for fluff, but in the future they will be embedded in the museum to allow people to make these connections more deeply, and particularly for those younger audiences who are confident to move between the digital and the physical real world very quickly. So meaningful experiences encapsulates a lot of thinking, but ultimately it's creating deeper learning and greater connection. Our final mindset of the Museum of the Future, and perhaps is the most pertinent for what's going on, is that they will become alive and responsive. Whatever they display, they will feel like places for right now. They will be agile and able to change, taking the lead in advocacy and thought leadership, and they will use their trusted voices to facilitate and host public dialogue with partners across science, politics, industry, and the arts. They will be in tune and receptive to what's happening in the world rather than sealing themselves off from it. They will ultimately respond, react and reply on both local and global scales. Museums being responsive sees them engage outside of their four walls. And Lauren Parker, Head of Creative Partnerships at the Museum of London, asked us, where are the thresholds of the museum? If it's only when we reach the front door, then we failed. And so to kind of begin with this thinking of how we can become more alive and responsive, we're really interested in the idea of the actively networked museum. Museums of the future will become more de-siloed and work together in interconnected ways, truly embracing the concept of museums working as a verb. Individually, that might be working with those multidisciplinary partners, and collectively, existing networks such as the Museum Association will be strengthened. Larger museums will support smaller museums, and the smaller museums can share their nuanced knowledge on how to facilitate that deep community value and connection. Moments such as this conference remind us that many of us are solving the same problems at the same time. So by doing more of our thinking in public and by being more generous with our resources and insight, we believe museums of the future will be actively and collectively more resilient and innovative. From a public-facing perspective, the live action theme within this suggests museums of the future will respond to local and global events through engaging programming, being able to recurate work, carry out rapid response collecting, or inviting new partners and community to reinterpret exhibitions. Ultimately, museums will change and adapt to respond to the needs of the public. And in order to do this, our final aspect of becoming alive and responsive is through museums becoming brave. They won't wait to respond to criticism or change, and they'll be confident to fail, recognizing that, of course, this is part of innovation, taking on and owning the messiness of not being neutral. This bravery aspect is particularly important when we're thinking about those plural perspectives, but also really is central to this future-facing sense of creating positive change. We're really hopeful that this change can be created by the shared passion of individuals working within their museums and their deep understanding, and that's something that really did come through all of our research, of the impacts that they could have on and for their community. So that's kind of a real whistle-stop tour of our 5 mindsets. And as we said, the report is live. Simon is going to kindly share a link to it in the chat, and also you can visit Liminal Space website or UKRI also to get links through. There's much more richer detail and thinking included. Obviously, I kind of took you through a real quick thinking of all of this. But as Sarah and Alexis have already outlined, this is an ongoing process. So please do feed into the survey at the end of the report, or share with us your thought around some of these mindsets, because we are looking to support museums and galleries through developing these into really useful tools for you all. So thank you very much for sitting and sharing some of that thinking with us, and hopefully we have a time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Liv and Sarah. That was brilliant. There's some really fab examples and case studies and comments in the chat, so hopefully you'll both get a chance to read through that as well, but thank you. So there have been a couple of questions that have come in. We've only got, I think, about 10 minutes left. So we've had a couple. I'll just go back in and see if there's any others, but the first one that came up in this morning's session as well, which was reflections on the future of museums, has come back in, and it's very pertinent, really. The question is from Karen MacDonald. It's brilliant that so much public sector work is moving towards being community driven, but now that multiple sectors and organisations are reaching out to the same communities in the same geographical areas, how do we avoid overburdening those communities with responsibility, emotional and intellectual labour? So I don't know if you both have any initial thoughts on that one. I'll let you have a go, and then I can chip in as well.
Yes, I think that's something that's definitely emerging through all of our work. I think one of the big things, and I know it sounds very basic, but is this sense of reciprocation. lots of people are being invited or being asked to contribute to new ways of working or new mindsets or kind of things like that. And I think something that often is not considered is what is the reciprocation there. So whether that's really simple things like remuneration or thinking about how something can be more sustained and valuable, I think is something to really factor in when we're reaching out. Often we reach out to these communities at times of crisis in order to get some more information or things like that. So I definitely think learning about how we can create long-term reciprocation with these communities and will create much more sustainable and meaningful relationships in that sense.
And just to add to that, when we spoke to many of the interviewees and we discussed this issue, and one of the things that really came across was working with communities to platform what it is that they want to do, that working in a very unagendered way. And so, you know, that might mean giving over the space for something that the community wants to do in its own way, as opposed to the agendas we might bring to it.
Thank you. I think from a sort of a funder's perspective, and sort of it's been noted that there is a shift towards doing things in this way rather than a top-down direction, which is good. Is that we have to be realistic with ourselves as well and appreciate that not everybody will want to be involved and not everybody will. I think it's less about sort of feeling like it is for them and more making sure that they know the opportunity is there. So for us, it's about creating more of those opportunities and ensuring that more people know how they can be involved if they want to be, but also sort of being realistic in the expectations that we as funders have of the organisations that we fund, by sort of realising and knowing that you won't reach everybody because not everybody wants to be reached necessarily. Okay, so I hope we've given some answers to that one. We've got another question from Joanna Maudsley. How do we change the narrative around culture and what that actually means? We still get a lot of, it's not just for me, despite many years of outreach and community engagement. Is this about changing education and curriculums? And Sarah, I know that you've done some interesting sort of opportunity scoping around education and curriculum. So I don't know if you want to answer this one.
I mean, I think that we all now know that what we might term hard to reach is in many ways our failure to reach people, which starts very early on in our education system, and how the arts are valued and how culture is valued and brought to people from a very early age. So one of the things that we think is crucial is how museums work with the school system, and we featured a fantastic example in Pittsburgh of a school which is inside the museum, and so really thinking about how can this practice be inserted into the education system from a very early age, and so I think that there is to the question of it's just not for me. Again, I suppose I question how much of that is really going to that grassroots level and understanding what people regard as their own culture and their own taste and their own versions of preciousness and their own versions of the sacred, and really developing and understanding what that is and platforming that in different ways, rather than what still happens so often, which is to really assert what we within the sector might think of as being the cultural artifacts that are of value to people. So, and I think also to Liv's point earlier about thinking more messily or more in public is to maybe be more open about these struggles and to understand, have more of a conversation about what we regard as for us or not for us.
And I also think particularly our nomadic access really speaks to that idea. I think so much of that feels like we have to get people through the doors into our space for it to feel like them. And we're adjusting our physical spaces to react to people that perhaps have otherwise felt excluded. But perhaps that mindset speaks to going to them and creating something where they are, and making that kind of effort, I guess, to create a sense of a museum and what a museum is, and the research and the thinking and the education somewhere outside of those spaces that perhaps inherently will never feel comfortable or relevant to some communities. Oh, you're on mute, Alex.
Sorry, I think we've got time for one more. Thank you. This is a kind of a clustered question. There's been a couple of questions around the same theme. What are the barriers to all of this actually happening? How soon do we think that we can move towards this model? And I know that through the chat, there's been lots of examples of how particularly nomadic access happens already. These have come from Mark McLeod, Elaine and Rhiannon.
Shall I start with that? Start with barriers. There are barriers all around us at the moment. In fact, I think, especially with the election today, I'm sure we're all slightly on edge, and it feels like 2020 has basically just been big barriers. So, very pertinent question. And I think, of course, we don't diminish that. Of course, funding and investment is one barrier that many struggle with all the time, and particularly at the moment. So there are many barriers just to be getting, just to kind of get through what has been a really difficult time. So, and will continue to be. So, of course, that is there is a huge barrier there. But I think one of the things that was really interesting for us in the research and in speaking to people and the many conversations that we had was actually a feeling of a bit of frustration that this feeling that actually there were things that could be changed or should be changed, and this was particularly around issues around decolonisation and around these plural narratives and plural perspectives, and that there was a kind of feeling of frustration, and that this current situation could be a catalyst for change, and so I think it's sort of trying to hold on to and doing some deep work within individual museums, and of course the situation will be different for different practitioners, but to really think about what are the things that we can change from where we stand, what are some of the small changes that we can make, and that's where mindsets for us does feel important. You know, what are some of the things that we can do within our teams, within the people that we work with, within the partners that we work with, that really sort of take this, what is at the heart of the museum, which is a spirit of inquiry and curiosity, and find ways to use that as a way to kind of innovate out of some of the many barriers that we face. So the answer is lots of barriers, but I hope that we can sort of start with small steps towards creating some changes in these domains.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Sarah said. I think our aim with these being mindsets is they're almost lenses with which we can look at our work, and whether that's writing a press release or some interpretation, or thinking about putting on a public programme and specifically spending time thinking who we're going to invite into that. Building these mindsets into our processes that we know we are already doing, and recognising the simple changes that can actually empower us to feel more confident to level some of this thinking at bigger scales as we kind of go through.
Okay, thank you both. I think that's all we have time for, but thank you so much. I'm going to hand back over to Simon. I think there's lots of links to the work and to the new funding call in the chat as well. So hopefully everyone has those now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alexis, Sarah and Liv. That was fantastic. It's a really great session. Thanks also to the captioners and the audio describers, doing a great job as ever. It's brilliant. And so the next session we have coming up is on the impact of COVID on regional museums. That starts in 15 minutes. Looks like it's a really interesting session that's been developed for us by the Museum Development Network. So looking forward to that. Don't forget this session will be recorded and will be available on the MA website soon. And also a reminder that the MA Hub is open all afternoon. If you want to meet other delegates for an informal chat, you can find the link on our conference program and head to that. But that's it. Thanks again to all your attendees. And as ever, thanks for commenting and asking so many brilliant questions and posting things in the chat. See you all later. Thanks so much.